A new season means new gear coming to the Division 2 and the potential to find new synergies. I believe I've found one perfect for evolving your Charmeleon to a Charizard. How are we going to do this? By tackling the Chameleon's biggest weakness, its accuracy. Let's dive into the Charmander build, a build that you can get almost completely from seasonal caches that absolutely spits fire and does tons of damage that's actually based around some concepts from a former build. Let's get stuck into it. Let's quickly recap the original build that we are evolving from. I discussed this build in my Chameleon build video 5 months ago, so check that out for the full details. The whole concept was based around finding a way to mitigate Chameleon's greatest shortcomings while still maintaining power. Chameleon is an AR with the spread and range of an SMG. While our damage does decrease after we hit beyond our optimal range, the massive spread of Chameleon reduces our hit percentage and therefore our damage at all ranges and is much more significant. So this original build utilized 2-piece Overlord, including the Fox's Prayer knee pads to get accuracy for a big boost in tightening up our spread. The other 4 pieces of this build could be 4 pieces of any gear set. For this build I chose Striker. The Chameleon is a fast-firing weapon, good for stacking Striker quickly, and the additional weapon handling also helps. Of course, since we're at skill tier 0, none of the skills are particularly good except for a shield and revive hives, so we'll keep those. If you'd like to try something actually interesting, be my guest, but if you're struggling, these 2 skills are safe bets. Before we dive into the evolution of this build, let's discuss our 4-step dispatch build making method, also called DBMM. Our role is damage, and we are going body shot weapon damage since Chameleon gives us a lot of crit and isn't accurate enough for headshots. If we're running solo, we also need to take on another role to keep us alive, and that's what the armor on kill from Gunner and a shield are for, but we'll come back to that survivability in a bit. This step tells us what kinds of bonuses and attributes we're looking for on our gear. We'll want crit for minor attributes, some accuracy brand bonuses, some damage, or even armor-based repair talents, and maybe some armor on kill or armor regen brand bonuses. Step 2 is deciding what range we're playing at. Since we're using the Chameleon, we're going to be playing at close range, but also hoping to hit a bit of the mid-range with our extra accuracy. Step 3 is choose highly efficient pieces to fill out the gear slots, and this is where the evolution comes in. This season brings us the spot-on named knee pads from the new brand set Urban Lookout. Urban Lookout's 1-piece bonus gives us 10% accuracy, which is a pretty small amount, but it is the stat that we are looking for. The spot-on knee pads give an additional 38% accuracy, which is bonkers. You might be wondering how I got these named knee pads since they just released with this season. Well, in true form of this build being extremely easy to obtain, these are actually available this week at the Castle vendor. Big thanks to WillyPete on Reddit for putting the word out. He's the guy who also helped me with my turmoil testing. Alright, back to the build. We just said we want crit for our minor attributes, but we already get tons of crit from Chameleon, and the accuracy is so efficient for this piece that it just doesn't matter. That we just don't need any more crit in that spot. Our last build used Striker as the gear set, but this time I'm going to switch it up to Negotiator's Dilemma. Totally fine to keep it as Strikers if you want, it is the meta set. For all you new and low shade level players, Negotiator's Dilemma will come out of the firearm season cache from last season, or you can farm it really quickly in a targeted loot zone, countdown, or summit. So this build is going to be supremely easy to farm. Let's recap Negotiators for anyone who doesn't understand how it works, and for those of you who do, you can skip ahead 30 seconds. Negotiators, like almost all gear sets, gets most powerful when 4 pieces are equipped, which unlocks its unique talent. This talent is centered around crits. What happens is, anytime you crit on an enemy, a mark will appear over their head, and the damage of that bullet will transfer to other marked enemies. This transfer damage will be 60% of the target damage, But if you have the backpack, it will increase a ton to 112%. If only one enemy is marked, no transfer damage is done though. We can have a maximum of 3 enemies marked unless we have the chest piece equipped, in which case we can mark up to 5. Therefore, we always want to have the maximum number of enemies marked that we can, and we want to crit as much as possible to get as much transfer damage as possible. With the Chameleon, once we proc the headshot buff, we're getting even more crit, 20% critical hit chance and 50% critical hit damage. We can either drop down our crit chance to around 40% and rely on getting the buff of Chameleon to get us back up to 60%, which is what I would recommend, or we can just go for 60% with our minor attributes and mods to make sure Negotiators is always firing on all cylinders. With the setup I have, I actually wasn't able to go any lower than 46% critical hit chance unless I re-rolled my Bellstone chest, which I didn't want to bother with. There are some other weird tricks to Negotiators, like being able to bypass armor plates of heavies, but I won't go into that here. Check out my interesting investigation for more info in the card if you're curious. So the backpack does a ton of extra damage if we can keep 3 enemies marked with a good uptime. The chest piece has a ton of potential, but when actually in gameplay, it can be rare to even have 5 enemies in line of sight, much less 5 able to be marked. Not only that, but it takes a while to get that many marks, and as the fight winds down, you'll go from 5 to 4 to 3 to 2 to 1 marks, and that's a lot of lost damage. The Negotiator's backpack is ridiculously powerful, but the chest, it's pretty niche. I think the best version of this build uses a Palisade or Bellstone chest with Obliterate for a little extra repairs and a bit more single target damage. Once again, we're still referencing our table from step 3 of the build process to help flesh out this build. This piece is going to be much more difficult to farm than the rest of the pieces. Speaking of our table from step 3, we can use armor cores to buff up our armor regen and armor on kill, as well as buffing our shield. As with all Chameleon builds, its talent is giving us so much weapon damage that we're not really losing that much damage by trading off some of those weapon damage cores to armor cores. Since Negotiator relies so much on having line of sight and exposing ourselves to hit multiple enemies, in my opinion, more repairs and effective health pool are critical for getting those marks that we need. If we don't have the chest piece that we want, we can always try throwing in the Negotiator's chest, and this opens up some interesting options. We can use the name Legatus mask, Visionario. This gives us 50% optimal range, pushing us out to 30 meters, which is around the optimal range of most ARs. Now, while it still has more spread, I think, than most ARs, this will definitely allow us to engage effectively from farther out. We could also instead slot in an exotic in one of our other slots, something like the new Overdog gloves, which DJ Tickle suggested should give a huge damage boost if we're hitting the correct enemies. This damage boost should also translate to much higher transfer damage as well, since the transfer damage is determined by how much damage we're doing to our target enemy. If we're hitting the enemies in the correct class, that should proc that extra damage on our target enemy and also to the transfer damage to the other enemies, even if they're not part of that same tier. We could also use the Exodus gloves, which can re-proc the Chameleon talent. And this is where we get to the 4th and final step, which is really just the beginning. Test and refine. I can't sit here and say which version of this build or which of these gear sets is going to work best for you. You'll need to take these steps and try it out for yourself and experiment. I tried running this build for a bit and definitely noticed some things. You can see some footage of me running DUA Legendary solo with this build. Now, I'm not that great at Legendaries and I don't play them often, especially solo. That being said, this build still performed very well in this scenario. As I was palling around in this mission and in the open world, 2 things became very apparent. Number 1. When the headshot buff isn't active, our crit chance is going to be relatively low, so it'll be harder to get Negotiators marks. That being said, our crit damage and weapon damage are so high, to some extent for our single target damage, it doesn't really matter that much. Number 2. we are much more accurate. I can hit enemies way farther away than usual, which is really good for the open world. However, open world engagements are still sometimes far beyond the optimal range of this weapon, and most importantly, the engagements take too long to keep the buffs. We don't get an out of combat refresh of the buffs between waves in most activities, so unless we're raw dogging the spawn, we won't be able to keep the buffs. Same for legendary, it was just taking me too long to get through the waves of enemies to maximize its use. Now, we won't have this problem on most of the missions heroic and below, especially if we're being aggressive, so we just need to be mindful of our uptime. So that wraps up the build and modifications that we can try. We also discussed the dispatch build making method. Make sure to refer to the full video explainer if you have any questions. I've put it in the card above. Now it's time for you to let us all know which version of the Chameleon build you prefer and what customizations you're doing on your own. Even in your own Chameleon builds, are you integrating the new spot-on knee pads? What builds are you running? Let us know so we can all feed on each other's creativity and make better builds. Sadly, we're at the end of the video. Before you go, make sure to like or dislike the video. That's the most direct feedback I can get. If you want to leave a more detailed feedback or critique, put it in the comments. All feedback is welcome. Thanks for watching, agents, and until next time, this has been Dispatch. Take care out there.